Запись идет же, да? Потому что некоторые спрашивали меня.
Да, включили.
Ага, все, спасибо.
Ну, сначала надо разрешение спросить, Мария разрешает нам записывать или нет, а то потом уже...
Yeah, I'm gonna say that this is all my views and stuff, so I'll make a disclaimer that this is just my views, not of the US government or National Defense University.
Okay. Maybe we can start.
Okay, yes, it's already 5 p.m., so I think we should start. Good evening, dear Nazarbayev University community, dear colleagues, dear students and guests. Today we are glad to welcome you again at our GSPP webinar series, and today we are very glad and honored to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Mariya Omelicheva. Professor Omelicheva, thank you for joining us today and agreeing to give this interesting presentation. First of all, I know some of you may already know Professor Omelicheva or have read some kind of articles, books authored by a professor, but still let me introduce her briefly. Professor Omelicheva is currently working at National War College, National Defense University as a professor of national security strategy. Her background is international relations, foreign policy analysis, and comparative politics. She has extensively worked on a variety of transnational issues such as democracy and autocracy promotion, counterterrorism and security assistance, Islamic radicalization, and Nexus of Trafficking and Terrorism recently. And she has extensively focused also on post-Soviet Eurasia and particularly post-Soviet Central Asia. So again, as I said, she is the author of many peer-reviewed journal articles and also few published books. One of them is Counterterrorism Policies in Central Asia, published by Routledge in 2011. Then Democracy in Central Asia, Competing Perspectives and Alternate Strategies, published by University Press of Kentucky 2015. And finally, Web of Corruption, Trafficking, Terrorism, Nexus in Central Asia, published together with Lawrence Markovits by Columbia University Press in 2019. And she'll be presenting particularly this book today. Before to go to the presentation, just a few words about how we're going to proceed today. First of all, Professor Omelicheva will going to present for about 25-30 minutes. Then we have our discussant, Professor Dina Sharipova of GSPP. She's going to spend 5-10 minutes kind of addressing her thoughts, her questions regarding the book. And then we're going to open the floor to the audience and we will have a Q&A session. But if you have any questions during the presentation, you don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. You can leave your questions, comments below in the chat function. So then I will address the questions right later during the Q&A session. And the last point, if you're not speaking, please unmute your microphones because to avoid some kind of background noise. I think you can now start, and I want to give the floor to Professor Omelicheva. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Janibek, for your very kind introduction. And of course, many thanks to Dina for inviting me. That's my pleasure. And thank you so much to all of you who join us this evening in Astana, because I know you guys have a lot of things to do on a Monday morning other than listen to the Webs of Corruption book. So I really appreciate you taking your time. So I have a brief presentation, if I can share it with you, just to accompany, to go along with my talk. You should be able to see it, right? Some thumbs up?
Yes, we see it.
All right, so thank you again. So let me begin by reminding you of dominant narrative that appeared in the aftermath of the 9/11. As you may remember, after the September 11th attacks, it has become obvious that many belligerent groups such as Al-Qaeda or later ISIS, they derived extensive financial profits from participating in organized crime, right? And so that gave rise to the so-called crime-terror nexus, and you could witness it in just a range of publications that came out in the decade or two after the 9/11. And of course, it's not a new phenomenon. We had a talk about narco-terror nexus in Colombia and other parts of South America. But it has really been popularized in the decades following the 9/11. And it has been argued that there are two developments in particular that has contributed to, that has facilitated the rise of the crime-terror nexus. One of those developments has to do with the fact that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, terrorist groups' primary revenue means, the state sponsorship, has disappeared. Right, so the terrorist groups had to resort to other ways of funding their activities, including resorting to illicit activities such as drug trafficking and some instances human trafficking and other types of illicit activities. And concurrently, there have been advances in information and communication technologies, developments in commerce and finances, the ease of cross-border movements. So all of that enabled terrorists and criminals to exploit the dark side of web, the dark side of commerce, etc. So those two developments allegedly facilitated the crime-terror nexus. So fast forwarding back, I mean, not fast forwarding, rewinding back 5-7 years, Lawrence Markovitz, my co-author, and I, we were drawn to this narrative just like many other scholars. We were and are scholars of political violence, authoritarianism, and security challenges in Central Asia. So we were really interested in exploring what's going on. But there was also another thing that really struck our curiosity and attention, and that was the fact that once you look at the list of states that allegedly have had this merger of trafficking and terrorism, a lot of those states happen to be at the top of the list of the corruption index. So most of the states that experience, or they say that they experience this merger of terrorism with trafficking, they're also among those who experience issues with rule of law and pervasive corruption. And we were not the only one who pointed out that there is something going on as far as the crime-terror nexus is concerned, that we cannot really understand it without considering the role of the state in the relationship between criminals and terrorists. And as a matter of fact, a very famous scholar who is currently at the Brookings Institutions, Thelma Brown, she once quipped, and I quote her, "The best way of being a drug trafficker is to work for the Ministry of Counter Narcotics." And she does a lot of research on Latin America, not so much in Central Asia, but we thought that that would be worthwhile to really look much more closer and critically at those alleged intersections, how prevalent and how enduring those relationships between criminal organizations and terrorist groups are. So those are kind of the motives that led us to conceive of a much broader project. So this book is part of a bigger project where Lawrence and I looked at drug trafficking, human trafficking connections with terrorism across Eurasia, Russia, North and South Caucasus, and Central Asia. So, and we were very lucky to receive funding from the Office of Naval Research, and you saw that disclaimer on the opening slide that all of this research was funded by the Minerva grant. And last but not least, I should have mentioned at the beginning that I work for the Department of Defense, but these views do not represent official views of any nature. I speak as a scholar here, so my views do not represent official views of the US government, of the Department of Defense, or National Defense University, so that's an important disclaimer to make. All right, so I like to put my arguments up front. So these are the three kind of takeaways, if you wish, that I would like to put out there if you haven't read the book, but this is what I believe are the most important takeaways from the book. So number one, we challenge the assumption that the interactions of terrorist and criminal activity is as pervasive and as enduring as we have been led to believe. Okay, so there is a great variation in the nature, the strengths of the relationships between terrorist and criminal groups, and this relationship varies greatly across contexts. Moreover, there are many more obstacles to their collaboration, to the collaboration of criminal and terrorist groups than there are facilitators of their interactions. The second argument that we make is that we cannot understand this relationship without bringing state back in. It is state collusion in drug trades, because we are looking at drug trafficking terrorist connections in the book. So I'm going to focus on drug trafficking, although some of the arguments I would suggest apply to other types of illicit activities, groups engaged in illicit activities of other nature, and their interactions with terrorist groups as well. So we cannot understand those without considering the role of the state, okay? And last but not least, we also question the simplistic view that drug trafficking necessarily amplifies terrorism, okay? And let me clarify this last point. You know, if you look at Central Asia, I'm not disputing the fact that there are instances of terrorism in the region, that there have been terrorist organizations operating in Central Asia. But if we look broadly, and if we look at comparative cases to Central Asian republics, overall, there have been very, very surprisingly low levels of terrorism. There have been lots of prognosis 2 decades back that Central Asia, given its location on this northern route that is used by traffickers to transit opioids from Afghanistan to Central Asia and on to Russia and Europe, and given all other circumstances, all other conditions that are associated with political violence, it's striking how considerably little violence, organized violence, terrorist violence, Central Asia has become. So we looked at the data that has been gathered systematically by the Global Terrorism data set that is maintained by the University of Maryland. And overall, Central Asia accounts for only less than 0.2% of the proved acknowledged terrorist attacks. And only 2 organizations on the list of more than 60 organizations maintained by the Department of State in the United States. Those organizations are designated as terrorist groups. Only 2 of those 60 have been found in Central Asia. So there have been considerably fewer, if any, terrorist groups kind of conventionally or traditionally speaking in traditional sense operating in Central Asia. And a lot of attacks, again, I'm not trying to minimize the significance of those or the tragedy of, that people experienced. But again, speaking analytically, kind of and dispassionately, the attacks have been smaller scale attacks, and a lot of those attacks have been disputed, whether with regard to whether they were truly terrorist, politically motivated, or criminal violence. And so, yeah, I said that Central Asia has not really had well-organized, ideologically driven violent Islamist organizations that many Muslim majority regions have. Okay, so that was another puzzle that we were struck and really wanted to understand what is going on, because if indeed there is so much trafficking in drugs that is happening and illicit activities is happening, so is this the relationship between drug trafficking and terrorism doesn't hold in Central Asia? Because we expected to find, we would, the expectation is that we should have seen more terrorist violence, because there is so much more support that is available to those groups, support from illicit activities that is readily available to those groups. Okay, so before I move on to kind of the relationships and evidence that we found, let me quickly clarify what we mean when we say crime-terror nexus. So this is a chart from our book. We think about crime-terror nexus in very, very broad terms. It's spatial and temporal coincidence of drug trafficking and terrorism. And we propose this pyramidal approach to the crime-terror nexus. So there is a pyramid that is enclosed in a cylinder. So a cylinder is kind of a visual representation of space, both time and physical space. So we really emphasize the importance of context. So terrorist and criminal activity takes place in specific context in time and in space. In the book, we look into various physical features of the environments where these activities take place. So at the very basic elemental level, at the basis of the pyramid, we have drug trafficking and terrorist activity taking place independent of each other. And in fact, this is how most of the time we have those two activities happening concurrently without any kind of physical interactions or any kind of other interactions between terrorist and criminal organizations. But we're also seeing instances of the so-called operational relationships. Operational relationship, it's when a terrorist group resorts to illicit activity out of the need for revenues, or more recently, another example of operational relationship is when terrorist groups seek to recruit former criminals because of their connections and other types of skills, or it's when a criminal organization, because there are some politicians that are not, so their activities are not conducive to criminal groups' activities. So for political reasons, they resort to, for example, assassination or other types of violence. So those are the operational relationships. Then you kind of go up this pyramid, you have alliance relationship where terrorist and criminal groups form alliances of different nature. Those are marriages of convenience. They are non-enduring. They are usually fleeting. They form, they fall apart. So examples would be Al-Qaeda using Italian mafia to forge passports, or to use fraud in real estate fraud to set up headquarters for Al-Qaeda cells in Europe. Examples during the Yugoslavia war in the Baltics, when KLM, exchange of cash for arms. So those are kinds of examples where groups resort to each other's skills and an ability to do something that they cannot do in-house. To facilitate the activities that are consistent with their purposes. Last but not least, very rarely, but possible when, for example, a terrorist group normalizes crime to the point that activity becomes defined terrorist group's identity, it changes. It kind of gets diluted, that ideology gets diluted with criminal motives. So hybridization of an organization takes place. Abu Sayyaf is an example. Islamic movement of Uzbekistan is an example of this hybridization or convergence relationship, when a group kind of changes its identity from, or kind of goes back and forth between pursuing ideologically motivated violence and engaging in for-profit motivated criminal activities, and back and forth. So this is how we define crime-terror nexus. All right. And so the punchline again of our book is that the role of the state matters. Okay. So state is instrumental to our understanding the nexus, but exactly what kind of state do we talk about? And for the sake of simplicity, but even though we go into much more detail in the book, we think about the state or classify states along two dimensions. One of those dimensions is political will. Another is capacity or capabilities. So political will essentially stands for how sincere the state is in its official proclamations of fighting drug trafficking, of fighting illicit activities, okay? So there is indeed kind of sincere, meaningful effort to do something about it. And capacity or capability refers to, does the state have enough security resources? First and foremost, we're talking about customs, we're talking about border officers, we're talking about law enforcement, police. Do they have enough capacity resources to successfully implement political will? And so we argue that these two dimensions allow us to form kind of ideal types. Ideal types, usually states kind of fall into, or they understand that when I talk about state in this general terms, there is much more nuance that we recognize when we discuss those cases in the book. Okay, and so very briefly, I'm not gonna spend too much time and because I can talk in more detail in Q&A if you want me to. So the bottom line is this. So the higher the state capacity and the higher the political will to clamp down on drug trafficking and not allow state to collude in drug trafficking, okay, the less likely any kind of relationship between terrorist and criminal organizations would emerge. So in our book, we make a case that Uzbekistan fits into this category. You will say like, what? You know, we're not suggesting that Uzbekistan doesn't have corruption, okay? It does. The argument that we make there is that the Karimov government made a decision early on that allowing especially the local governments and allowing the security forces to become implicated or become colluded in drug trade, like in Tajikistan or in some other context where you have, it's the security forces that control the drug trafficking routes, that you know, they use drug trafficking to extort rents and so on and so forth. So this is not what's happening. There is corruption on the border. There are these kind of lower level border officers and some politicians that have been implemented in corruption, but the state has made a concerted effort to invest into security structures. They have, it's no secret, they have a very strong security agencies pyramid. And the government has used those securities to ensure, number one, obedience of the local officials. It clamped down on dissent, but it also precluded that collusion of the state with drug trade, and it prevented from the merger or emergence of any kind of relationships between terrorist and criminal organizations. You will probably ask me questions about, you know, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan that we put into the degraded capabilities category. And though we look very closely in Kazakhstan in particular, how much and what has been done as far as, you know, border troops or customs. Those of you who know the history, the customs office didn't have a home of its own. It has been moved from one agency to another. There have been a lot of rotation in the leadership personnel, and some of the leaders who led that agency, they didn't want to be there because it was considered to be detrimental to their career growth. Kazakhstan has invested a lot into the elite troops that has taken part in a variety of international operations and recognized internationally, but it has not invested enough into its police, into its customs, into its border security. So it is from that standpoint, if we look at the key actors that face the drug traffickers, they are not really well equipped. And they, especially in 1990s and early 2000s, morale suffered, and so on and so forth. So it is in that sense that we've put, even though the label is may come across as pejorative, but again, from an analytical standpoint, there was a lack of incapacity, even though there was stronger will. I would argue that in Kyrgyzstan, it has been somewhat changing, and under Bakiyev, again, so if you look temporally under the Bakiyev government, it probably is an exception to the trajectory overall, and we are watching what's going on in Kyrgyzstan right now to maybe change classification as well. And in lots of instances in Tajikistan, especially after its civil war, when a lot of political decisions were made that included the introduction of former militants and warlords with deep ties to, you know, drug trafficking activity, they became part of the government. And so that it initially particularly led to the capture of the state and the formation of much more complex intersections or interactions between criminal and terrorist groups there. I know I'm getting closer to being done here, but I do want to point out one more thing. As scholars, we recognize the importance of not presenting something that is not in Central Asia. So we have been very careful using the language of terrorism, okay? As a way of avoiding perpetuating the narrative that, you know, Central Asia is this super, super dangerous place, you know, filled with criminal and terrorist organizations. And to drawing on the work of David Lewis, who suggested that we look at a range of terrorist organizations that really vary in what they do, how they connect it to local communities. So he suggested this typology, looking at terrorist groups which are ephemeral, sporadic. Those are the transnational transnational terrorist organizations like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. So they're not so much concerned with control of local space. They are much more concerned with challenging international norms and institutions and shaping government policy through acts of violence. And they oftentimes target manifestations of globalization, manifestations of what they perceive to be kind of that Western might, Western meddling into their spheres of influence, if you wish. So they target airports, shopping centers, usually those mass casualties attacks. On the other hand, we have organizations that are localized insurgencies. They are embedded in local societies, in local political economies. They oftentimes grow out of local political disputes. Some of those disputes are ethnic political in nature. They are the ones who try to control and shape the space where they operate. So local organizations, local insurgencies are deeply embedded into the fabric of local political economy, local relations. They may opportunistically exploit transnational illicit flows, but it is not their primary focus. So when we talk about the crime terror nexus in Central Asia, what we refer to when we say terrorists, and we sometimes use terrorists in quotation marks, because that there is this really fine line. Their nature is so fluid, and because some of them, so yeah, it's difficult to analyze, and we are stuck with the accepted terminology, but we are trying to be very careful to not designate something that is not there as terrorist. So, but we're specifically looking into this, what we call localized insurgencies, and their connections with drug trade, which is oftentimes opportunistic, but their primary purpose is to exercise control, influence over resources flows, over they're plugged into the communities. So this is what we study. This is what we see more of in Central Asia than this other type of organizations. Okay, I'm going to skip that. All right. Well, actually, okay, let me just briefly read that. I think I have like 5 more minutes. So this is the conclusions. So the relationship of state capacity and trafficking terrorism nexus mostly characterize the patterns of relations between the local criminal and militant political groups among themselves and with the state, although some of these groups have held tenuous connections to transnational terrorist movements. So yeah, so all of this is happening at the local level rather than having, even if when they do use transnational ties, it's used for opportunistic, maybe PR purposes, but not an enduring feature of those connections. And so when a state has predatory capacity characterized by consolidated state control over the drug trade, independent trafficking groups have limited ability to ally with terrorist or militant movements, which are suppressed by the state, including through the penetration of society by security institutions. So part of the reason for why we see fewer incidents of terrorism in Central Asia, again, given that the nature of these organizations is local insurgencies, kind of this, with some of them implicated in collusions with the state, when the state has low political will, but still continues putting resources into strengthening its coercive capacity by funding security institutions, including through security assistance from Russia or the United States. So Tajikistan in particular falls into this category. Tajikistan has been able to strengthen its security institutions considerably. I would argue that it has some of the strongest security institutions in Central Asia, largely as a result of the influx of security aid from the international donors, but it has never had meaningful approach, like strong desire to root out those illicit activities, but it has been able to clamp down on the kinds of networks that are threatening to the state. And some of those were viable threats, but with that clampdown, it also effectively prevented the emergence of any kind of enduring relationships between criminal and terrorist organizations, and so on and so forth. So in states with the predatory and hegemonic capacity, the strong coercive apparatus is used to suppress violence, dissent, and terrorism, including through the penetration of society by security institutions, right? Okay, and so again, the concluding statement is that the state in Central Asia has played a role of the quintessential protection racket with the advantage of legitimacy, struggling with other groups to achieve monopoly over the means of violence and control over economic activities. And in this process of contention over control of resources and power, transnational jihadist movements have played a marginal role. Okay, so I think I'm just in time. I'm gonna conclude here. I know I talked about it in very broad strokes, and many of you are still puzzled, like what exactly is going on. It is a big challenge to summarize everything in like 25-minute presentation, 30-minute presentation. So I'm gonna open it up to questions, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this interesting topic. And you're actually right. I mean, the book itself is very rich in terms of how it addresses this nexus between crime and terrorism. And another point that I want to make is, indeed, in Central Asian countries, I mean, when you talk to ordinary people about this drug trafficking issue, many people seem to perceive that actually it's all state controlled. I mean, also state involvement. I mean, I heard the same kind of narratives in Kyrgyzstan. I heard the same kind of reaction from people in Tajikistan, or even here in Kazakhstan. I mean, when there is a big party of narcotics, for instance, is caught on the customs, people just say, okay, it's just state is doing their normal. So this seems to be very, very kind of present on the bottom level. Thank you very much again. Now I would like to invite Professor Sharipova as a discussant for her comments, questions.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria, for your wonderful presentation. First of all, I would like to thank you that you have agreed to take part in our webinar. I know that it's too early right now in the United States. It's like 6 a.m. So thank you so much. And of course, while I was reading your book, I found it very interesting and insightful because it provided a very rich empirical data. It provided very interesting, actually elegant and parsimonious theory about the relationship between state capacity and the traffic, crime, terror. And I would like, I'm not going to talk about the book much, but I would like to highlight some points and ask maybe a couple of questions, and then give the floor to other participants of this webinar. So first of all, what I would like to say is that I was really fascinated by the very, let's say, a complex research design, right? 3-stage research designs that combined case studies of 4 Central Asian countries, plus also you try to extrapolate your theory toward other contexts such as Syria, Sri Lanka, the Balkans. You also used regression analysis. You used geographical methods, or GIS enabled tools to map terrorist criminal connections. And of course, this created a very rich empirical data for your research. So this is, I think that we have to give applause for that as scholars. So the authors make a number of interesting, important points that I would like to focus and highlight. And one of them is, of course, important argument and contribution of the book to the wider literature on crime-terror nexus is the development of this theory that explains the nexus between state capacity and its impact on crime-terror linkages. So the state capacity, and especially variation in state capacity across the states, plays an important, crucial role in what forms of relationship criminal and terrorist organizations might develop in Central Asia. So the authors establish causal effects between state capacity and types of trafficking terror nexuses. And one of the important issues that actually Maria highlighted, and I also want to emphasize that the authors don't treat state as a unitary, like a billiard ball actor, but try to disentangle it into a number of array of different actors that might contribute to this nexus. So important point that authors make is that they try to resolve this empirical puzzle, why Central Asian states have a low level of terrorism compared to other countries. And this is really interesting because Central Asia is located close to Afghanistan and Pakistan that are major producers of opium. And they are transit countries through which narcotics go to Europe and Russia, but still we have a very low level of terrorist violence across Central Asian states. So the authors also claims that in the context of Central Asia, the role of state or the state's involvement in drug trafficking has an integrative effect, and that state engagement in drug trade tends to decrease the frequency and intensity of terrorist attacks, which is very, very puzzling. But what I would like to know more maybe about the causal mechanisms behind the state involvement in drug trade and reduction of violence. Since the state capacity is an important variable that determines the nexus, can we assume that changes in state capacities, whatever you define it, security state capacity plus the will of political will, whether these changes in state capacity might in fact influence the level of violence in the countries? And will this level of violence vary depending on different types of state capacity? Also, authors talk about the prevalent and critical role of state in this crime-terror nexus. What is the role of space and organizational structures, as well as socio-economic factors in the context of Central Asia? So Maria, for instance, emphasized a lot about the role of the state, but also it would be interesting to know what is the role of other socio-economic factors and organizational structure, and especially the impact of the space or terrain of the Central Asian states that influence the crime-terror nexus. So, for instance, the authors claims that certain socioeconomic developments are more susceptible to the emergence of trafficking terrorism nexus in one country versus the other. So I also found it very interesting that you established the impact of the number of employees. So the greater per capita number of employees in public administration, education and health services, it might lead to the lower probability or likelihood of the trafficking terrorism nexus. So, I mean, working in the graduate school of public policy, it is interesting, right, to know how that the size of the public employees, in fact, might influence this trafficking terrorism nexus. So, if you would maybe explore or explain this in detail, that would be great. And also, you're talking about, if you talk about implications, you're talking about strengthening security and coercive capacity of the states as an important factor on the one hand, but on the other hand, strengthening coercive capacity of the state might lead to quite detrimental, or I would say undesirable outcomes or effects. So what should be done by the government to increase security capacity of the state and eradicate the nexus between terrorist and criminal organizations? What would be the implications for security forces if we can make certain conclusions from the series that you develop? And actually, I have a number of other questions, but I would probably stop here and give time to Maria to answer this.
Wow, but excellent questions. Thank you so much. I will tackle three.
Okay.
I will try to be brief, but I would be happy to elaborate. So the first question was about whether changes in state capacity may influence the level of organized violence. So the short answer is yes, but I would like to qualify it by saying that organized violence is a very broad in nature. So one of the things that I do as a scholar is to push this narrative that emphasizes how limited our conceptual vocabulary has become. So we are so accustomed to classifying violence into these preconceived categories. You know, this is terrorism, this is some kind of other political, this is crime, etc. And what I find, and what Lawrence and I find in our research, is that oftentimes violence, organized violence, it has become so complex in nature that it's difficult to put into either one of those categories. And so we place emphasis on really interrogating this mix of interests that's behind any kind of political violence, organized violence. Organized violence, it's a kind of violence where there are political interests as part of the motives that brought about. And we find, like right now we do research on Kyrgyzstan, and we see that there have been a weakening of the state power vacuum, and it has been exploited by not only those competing for power within those intra-elite, you know, networks, but those power nodes, they are kind of those pyramidal, in a sense that you cannot really become extraordinarily powerful politically without some kind of backing by economic and, in many instances, criminal interests. And then there is kind of this relationship of exchange. You help me to mobilize supporters, or you help me to become elected, but in response, in return, I am gonna give you X, Y, and Z. I'm gonna propose the policies that are conducive to your ability to pursue your illicit, quasi-illicit, or illicit interests. All right, so in that sense, if we look at organized violence in a broader sense, I think this argument that it's change in state capacity, it does entail, or it has a window of opportunity for violence to emerge. It doesn't necessarily happen. There are many other conditions that have to be present. But yes, I think the change in state capacity may and does influence levels of organized violence of different nature, not only terrorist, but also other types of political violence, including violent escalation of protests or political dissent. And then you brought up that the fact that we do look beyond case studies to examine other geographic terrain factors and socioeconomic conditions. And a lot of those conclusions are not brand new. They're not path breaking, in a sense that we've already known for a long time that terrorist and criminal organizations, especially criminal organizations, they really want to operate in the hubs of economic activity with developed banking system, with developed transportation system. So we do find much more of that happening in capital cities and rural areas, close to transportation infrastructure, close to state borders, if it's a cross-border activity. You know, so we already know, you know, how mountainous terrain is an impediment. Or in the case of Kazakhstan, part of the reason for why there has not been an emergence of kind of nationwide drug trafficking cartels, it's the size of the country. You have, you know, you have urban areas, highly populated, but they are separated by swaths and swaths of lands. And, you know, this both prevented the government from being able to exercise unquestionable control, but also prevented the other kinds of groups to consolidate their influence over drug trafficking routes, for example. So those kinds of things matter. We are very cautious with regard to, you know, some of the socioeconomic variables like poverty and unemployment. On the one hand, yes, unemployment is one of the factors that facilitate the nexus, but the relationship between poverty and terrorism, as we know, is much, much more nuanced and depends on the range of conditions. So when you asked about this last question with regard to how employment in a range of government positions and medical workers and teachers and educational establishments, we made an assumption, and this is, you know, feel free to take me on that. So we made an assumption that we don't know 100% the level of corruption in the countries, okay? But what we do know is that these countries still rely on kind of client patron networks and relations, that it is, again, analytically speaking, those are important because those are oftentimes the means of coping, the means of survival, and they are oftentimes exploited. So what we are arguing is that even if we have the official data on poverty, it's not going to tell us exactly how well or not people are doing. And so we are implying that the more people a state has working for educational institutions and for government agencies. So those are the kind of the offices with the opportunities for rent seeking, right? So even if we have official statistics suggesting that the country is in dire poverty, most of the time with many people employed in those positions, the people are actually better off because they have other informal mechanisms to improve their well-being. And this could be one of the reasons that we don't find a correlation between poverty and terrorism and poverty and crime-terror nexus, because there are all these other ways in which people can make and met, okay? And last question was with regard to strengthening coercive capacity. And it's a difficult one. I think what we want to avoid is investing into the institutions that we know the governments are using for securing regime, okay? So we've seen it in, not just in Central Asia, but in many other post-Soviet states where a reform of security institutions amplifies the role of kind of National Guard-like agencies that are there to deal with possible dissent, or riot police, or the security forces that are there to protect top leadership, right? Or to somehow increase the international reputation of the state. And so we need to balance, and we need to make sure that investments are actually put into the agencies that face these activities on a day-to-day basis. Where do the investigations take place? It's, police, law enforcement, who are the first to face contraband, right? It's the customs officers, it's the border troops. So those are the types of agencies that require much more investments. And we also need to understand and make sure that no agency becomes too powerful vis-a-vis others. That then there's like this interagency competition may also hamper the government's efforts to be successful in combating trafficking or connections of trafficking and traffickers with politically motivated organizations.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Interesting questions and interesting answers. And of course, there's a lot of things to be discussed yet. Now, I would like to open the Q&A session. Please, if you have any questions, you can raise a hand or you leave your comments in the chat below. We've already received a few questions, I think very interesting. The first question that I would like to address is more kind of methodology related question, I think. So what are the criteria to refer countries to a specific group? How do you define high and low political will and capacity while categorizing the Central Asian states, I guess? And a related question, maybe, could you give an example of data that you worked with in your research? Maybe just these two questions, and then we go forward.
Yeah, excellent questions. And I will be honest with you, it is very difficult to, okay, so as a researcher, I never say that I prove anything, okay? So I have always taught my students, if you ever hear me saying I prove something, no, I am always using the language of probability. Take everything with that there is a likelihood, but not necessarily kind of 100% proof of anything, okay? There is always an element of uncertainty, and it has to do with the difficulties, methodological difficulties with studying these kinds of questions. Let me actually start with the second question because it's easier to answer. Yeah, there are almost, anytime you study drug trafficking, there is no 100% reliable data. So we relied on the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, but their data is also as good as what the governments share with them. So we do know really well that what is available to us is maybe 3 or 5% of what is actually happening. So the idea is to not tell you that exactly what is the percentage of, what is the increase in the likelihood that if you capture, 5,000 kilos more of heroin, then your likelihood of experiencing terrorist attacks is going to increase by 50%. So we don't give you this precision. Our argument is that so everything is patterned, okay? And those patterns can be established even though we cannot say with precision of what the magnitude of the impact between the source and the outcome would be. So as scholars, we are obliged to do reporting on everything that we collect. So it is available there, it's shared for anyone to take a look at and criticize and let us know how things could be done differently. So, but we trust the data that we've used with all of the limitations. We've done some other methodological tricks to ensure that we can use the data for drawing the conclusions that we made, including, and instead of just relying on the numbers like from 0 to 1,000, we will clamp them down into simpler and cruder variables, because again, we don't know for sure if it was 5,000 kilos of heroin that the border guards seized or more. So we played in so many different ways just to make sure that the relationship holds. The relationships hold, but again, we don't know with precision what the magnitude of the impact of X and Y. And it is even trickier when we try to apply our scheme classification on the qualitative data. Qualitative data you can, as twist and turn in so many different ways. So we took an approach of really looking systematically at law enforcement, security offices' capabilities from the time the countries have become independent. And, so in Kazakhstan, for example, we looked into how customs developed, how border troops have evolved, and where the funding was channeled towards which security agencies, which parts of the military. So that allowed us to make classifications. And again, others can disagree, but we rely on the peer review process. There, we were a team of 2 and we received reviews from many other scholars, some of whom were a little bit more skeptical than others. But I think it is when you are open in terms of, what you do and how you do it, you subject it to scrutiny and review by others, is when you you improve your confidence that even if you're not 100% accurate, you are within, those boundaries between completely inaccurate and one or another side. So the truth, if there is a truth, it falls somewhere in between those 2 points. So yeah, I thank you again for this question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we have another question here, I think, which is also important. So do you take into account joint efforts of regionalizing and analyzing the state capacity? For example, agreements and treaties on security between Russia and Kazakhstan, and also maybe under the other regional organizations, Shanghai and so on.
Well, great question. We looked into those, but how would I put this? I mean, this is a very good question. I think we need to be very careful extrapolating too much from the official declarations, from kind of the official documents that instituted those organizations and those cooperative agreements, because as you know, there is usually a gap between what the official documents say and how things play out in practice, right? So there is also a lot of hidden, there is a lot of the undercurrents of political security relations that do not get translated into official text, which is to say that the institution, the organization, the regional initiative may be officially pursuing X, Y, and Z, a set of purposes, but usually there are also unspoken motivations pursued by Russia in particular that may lead the campaign or the tactical operations, the the drug trafficking elimination operations kind of depart to a certain extent from the postulated, from the stated objectives. I think it's important to recognize all those discrepancies between the official and unofficial, the spoken and unspoken. And it is also very difficult. And while I do recognize the success of some of those, especially the joint kind of counter-narcotics operations that are run regularly under the auspices of this collective security treaty organization or based on some bilateral ties. But we also raise the question of how much is not done. You know, yes, we should acknowledge and recognize what is done, but also how much is not done. And then as researchers, we're interested, you know, where is all this taking place? How much is being reported? And then how does it fit into what do we know in terms of the trends? Are there any questions that pop at us? You know, why do we have, I mean, I'm not gonna use example of Kazakhstan, I'm gonna use example of Tajikistan. Why do we have a brand new scanner that was put on the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan, funded by the US government, and we have almost no reported seizures, right? Or what, so again, I'm not really answering your question directly. So if anything, as researchers, we will look at all this and we ask more questions than we provide answers, and we don't take any kind of official information at its face value. We try to explore not only what's presented to us, but also what's left out, and, you know, think in terms of counterfactuals. What should we expect to see given the announced capacity? Shouldn't there be more than what we have been presented with? Or, you know, why you have all these seizures and or if you have, again, I'm going to use the example of Tajikistan, you have a military operation that captures a bunch of former warlords implicated in drug trade, you put them in prison, but then you have recurrent prison outbreaks when a bunch of them, you know, escape. Hasn't happened in Kazakhstan, thankfully. But so we put all this together to make any kind of inferences, not relying on official statements exclusively.
Okay, thank you. I think we have just a few minutes left. Maybe I will ask this final two questions that we received. The first one is, what is your personal view on the question of the extent of medical organizations intervening criminal actions? The question is asking actually whether the medical organizations or state agencies can be embedded and shaped for lobbying interests, both government and criminal groups. So I think this is more related to the situation with COVID in Kazakhstan that we have here, when they had the medication, but the people were not receiving that medication. So can there be element of criminal groups or lobbying groups kind of lobbying those kind of decisions? I think the question. The second one is, with prosperity of virtualization and digitalization, to what extent the results of your research include the incidence of cyber terrorism or cybercrime?
All right. So very briefly on the first one, I'm going to use the example of Kyrgyzstan because it kind of hints at COVID. I think there, again, if we take it as a starting assumption that, well, number one, you have ministries of health, you have the state apparatus that is involved in, for example, the distribution of medical supplies or kits or tests that they've received as a result of humanitarian assistance as well, right? And then if we have reports that shows there is a huge mismatch between, you know, the either they've been received for free or they've been received for nominal value, and they've been either distributed for fee or for fee that is much higher. So there's an element of corruption, right? That's one way in which, again, you have those semi-private, private actors in cahoots with government representatives controlling, exercising control over decision-making and exercising control over how resources are distributed. There is an element of criminality and corruption, but there is also another way outside of Central Asia. You know, in the United States, for example, you know that the opioid overdose crisis is driven even less so by the influx of opioids. Right now, it's all about synthetic drugs fentanyl. China is the major source of the precursors and fentanyl. Some of those come through Mexico nowadays. But there is also prescription drugs, right? So in that sense, it is very difficult to prove this connection in the implications in criminality, that there is this malign intent by the medical organizations to perpetuate this crisis. But Purdue Pharma, if you've been following what's going on in the United States, Purdue Pharma is one of the major pharmacist organizations in the United States that was found responsible for fomenting the opioid crisis. So there is a connection between crime, not so much terrorism, but so yes, so I can think of multiple examples. And then the last question was about cyber terror. Cyberterrorism is such a contested term to begin with. We do not look into cyber terror per se. In the book, I would actually, so no, we don't do cyber terror. We don't look anywhere close. And we can even debate whether or not cyber terrorism is terrorism or it's just another catchy term. But there is a line of research that utilizes approaches that allow you to get at the dark web to collect information on drug trafficking. So what we did, we relied on open source data as reported by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and some other open source data. But my colleague Nazla Avdan at the University of Kansas, for example, there are tools that are available to researchers to look at the totality of transactions that are happening in the dark web as a way of collecting data that will provide the proxy measures of the amount of transactions that are happening in the world of illicit drug trade.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I will just ask the very brief last question. So as far as I know, the research on this crime terror nexus goes beyond Central Asia, right? It's a kind of a bigger project in that sense. So in that sense, could you please provide some comparison of Central Asia to other regions? Is there this nexus weaker or stronger compared to other regions?
Yeah, so we have an article on crime terror nexus in North Caucasus. And we actually find none in crime. It was like, what, North Caucasus is none? And one of the things that is different about Central Asia, or rather Caucasus, is that the criminal and terrorist milieu is so fragmented. I mean, there are so many competing interests and among security forces, a range of religious groups and a range of criminal groups, that sheer fragmentation, sheer amount of interest prevented from the emergence of any kind of consolidated long-term strong linkages. I don't think that the space is so fragmented in Central Asia. There is a much more consolidation in the case of Tajikistan, less so, but still, it is not nearly. And it's there are good and bad things about it. But the last thing I do want to say is that it doesn't mean that there is no violence. There is violence, but a lot of that violence is criminal in nature. So the trick is to not place criminal violence under the category, kind of making these hasty classifications or hasty allegations that it's all terror groups. And we've seen that happening in Central Asia and outside of Central Asia. So, but the bulk of criminal activity is still conducted by criminal organizations. There are a lot of them, and they pose a very important, very viable threat. And these organizations may turn violent. Violence is a byproduct of illicit activity. So we shouldn't discount that. The point that we are making is that terrorist groups are a very small fish in this large pond of criminality. Okay, but I don't want to diminish the nature of the problem or the magnitude of the problem that these governments face.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us today and giving this presentation. I remind us it's all 6 a.m. in the States, 6 p.m. here. So thank you all for joining us.
Yeah. Yes. I would like also to thank you, Maria, for joining this webinar. Thank you so much for your very insightful and interesting presentation. And we wish you to have productive research in the future on Central Asia. We see that the field of Central Asia is growing, and this is an important contribution. So we hope to receive your book for our library also in Nazarbayev University. Thank you.
Sure, let me know. I'll send you a copy. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Have a good start of the week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.